not saying that they have to run all the time. Just saying they can run. They can definitely run. They're humans. Humans can run.
Mo Farah would be the worst zombie to have on your back.
Yeah.
We've all done it. Imagining what we'd do on that glorious day of the zombie apocalypse. Which member of the archetypal ragtag band of survivors would we be? Where would we seek refuge from the undead horde? What everyday items would we take from our mundane existences to use as impromptu weapons? Or would we simply be the lone sociopath, thinking, when in Rome, and, alright, resorting to cannibalism? Just me then. But what if we got it all wrong? What if the shambling masses aren't as inhuman as we previously thought? What if we are the walking dead? The zombie. Slow, clumsy, bad at making small talk. Alone is about as dangerous as boiled cabbage. In this situation, it's hard to see just why Hollywood is so obsessed with the undead. That is, of course, until you see them in a group.
Zombie has no will of his own. You see them sometimes, walking around blindly with dead eyes, following orders, not knowing what they do, not caring.
You mean like Democrats?
The notion of the swarm is undeniably one of the most relentless and terrifying weapons in horror cinema's arsenal. An unstoppable force of nature, it breaks down barriers and crashes through walls. There is nowhere to hide. But there's an important question that needs answering if we're to get to the very heart of the zombie genre. Just who are the ones hiding, really? In order to answer this question, the best place to start is the 2013 film World War Z. This summer, Mark Forster's blockbusting addition to the Horde gave us a rare studio-backed insight into Hollywood's darkest fears. Costing the princely sum of $190 million to produce, this take on the undead Armageddon centres around former UN employee Jerry Lane. Lane makes for a strangely contradictory protagonist. He embodies the everyman, making DIY armour out of magazines, fighting for his loved ones' lives, but simultaneously jetting off all over the place like any celebrity with a messiah complex would. As Jerry trots across the globe in search of an elusive cure, the film essentially becomes a world tour of ruling class fears. Consider the opening credits and you may see what I'm driving at here. The titles are backed up by images of Piers Morgan and other insects scuttling across the screen in their multitudes. In other words, the unsettling imagery reflects Western ideology's subliminal fear of the swarm. We are implored time and again to see things from the inside of the walls where a tiny minority thrive whilst the outside world goes to hell. We are taught to fear the herd outside, thrashing at the gates, gnashing its teeth, and we await with dread for the masses to tear down our defences, to violate the sanctity of our little white picket fence private sphere, and subsequently annihilate us and our wealthy counterparts. We are then seeing the world through the eyes of the oppressors, the profiteers, the 1%. This is distastefully illustrated by Jerry's trip, particularly to Israel, in which a government official states that walls, in reality constructed to colonize Palestine and to cleanse the indigenous population from their homeland, were built in preparation for the coming onslaught of zombies. This paints Israel's regime of segregation as a common-sense precaution, protecting itself from the innate savagery of the masses walled outside waiting to destroy civilization. If this was 30 years earlier, Jerry Lane would probably have visited South Africa and been told by a member of the National Party, well, the blacks can't vote so that they can't try and eat all the whites. It's a precaution, really. Now, whilst I don't believe it was a conscious influence on the production of this film, it's worth pointing out that in 2011, as this film was in production, revolts spread across the Middle East. The discontent seemed to jump across borders, oceans and continents. It was as if the rage of the exploited and oppressed had gone viral. The fear amongst the wealthy and powerful has clearly then permeated Hollywood's collective consciousness. Of course, this reactionary flinch mechanism is not the only way that the zombie has come to prominence. In film and television, the walking deceased have also been used for some cutting social commentary. More often than not, the dead are not so very different from you and I.
Johnny,
You're still afraid.
stop it now. I mean it.
They're coming to get you, Barbara.
Stop it. You're ignorant.
They're coming for you, Barbara.
Stop it. You're acting like a child.
They're coming for you. Look, there comes one of them now.
The obvious example of that are the films of living dead legend George A. Romero. From the beginning of his career, Romero never shied away from using the undead to challenge injustice. In Night of the Living Dead, he made a gutsy move to have protagonist Ben gunned down by a redneck sheriff. The film had been due to end happily until Romero heard of the murder of Martin Luther King Jr., and the brutal point made is that when Ben, the African-American lead, is killed by police officers, they perceive him simply as a bloodthirsty, primitive threat to public order, and pull the trigger as if he weren't human. In a move echoed throughout the rest of the series, from the rioting consumers of Dawn of the Dead to the empathetic Bub, a zombie more human than most of the live soldiers in Day of the Dead, the undead swarm become increasingly indistinguishable from the mass of ordinary, exploited and oppressed people in living society. This finally comes to a head in Romero's finale to the original series Land of the Dead, in which the Horde isn't really something to provoke revulsion or fear, but rather empathy. They are tortured, used and abused by a wealthy minority, just like the living members of the remaining human outposts in Pittsburgh. This comparison eventually converges when Cholo, played by John Leguizamo, is bitten. Cholo has been denied the right to a better life in the community by his boss, played by the late Dennis Hopper, despite running life-threatening operations to procure luxury goods for the richest survivors. Seeing meritocracy to be an illusion, Cholo realizes that he inhabits a similar role in society to the zombies nailed to the walls outside the township for protection, or those inside prodded and ridiculed for entertainment. He decides that rather than be killed to prevent becoming one of them, previously considered to be one of the great terrors of the zombie genre, that he wants to go to the other side and subsequently joins a zombie revolt that tears apart the system of privilege limb by limb. However, outside of the staple Romero films, unfortunately the genre has been dubbed repetitive, unimaginative and lazy, prioritising sloppy gore and mindless teenage thrills over substance. This is certainly accurate of the majority of Z flicks destined for the bargain bin in Tesco. However, it is in itself unimaginative and lazy to write off an entire genre just because of that. You just need to know where to look.
If I get some down there, the fish shop.
The Canadian independent film Pontypool is exemplary of this. Adapted by Tony Burgess from his own novel, the film uses the zombie to explore the other, darker side of the swarm, that of reactionary politics. The film is entirely set within the confines of a basement radio studio, where a DJ and his colleagues mentally piece together the horrific bigger picture of an undead uprising from reports they receive over the phone. The beautiful twist here is that the film relies on language to build an ominous feeling of helpless dread, before we realise the virus itself is transmitted through language.
Not in the air, not on or even in our bodies. It is here. Where? It is in words.
Certain loaded words combined in any situation are capable of reducing people to bloodthirsty savages. The only way to overcome this virus is to forcibly deconstruct your trigger word, to see beyond the natural meaning you've been raised to see in it. It's impossible not to feel a hideous sense of unease at the fact that any combination of syllables, from anteater to single teenage Muslim lesbian mothers, could trigger a murderous response from the mass of ordinary people, especially since it's basically what the British press do every day. Where did he go? Where did he go? Tim, where have you gone?
When you compare Pontypool to Land of the Dead, the two beautifully illustrate the Rosa Luxemburg quote, "Society stands at the crossroads, either transition to socialism or regression into barbarism." Pontypool shows what happens if, rather than building an equal, free society for all, humanity's mass soul is won over by the forces of reaction and hate.
What are you?
Of course, the zombie is not just a metaphor for the struggle for humanity's soul. In some of the most recent politically biting additions to the genre, they are human. Most recently, In the Flesh, due a second series in 2014 despite being absurdly out of step with BBC Three's usual tabloid grotesquerie. The show is like the love child of George A. Romero and Ken Loach, blending supernatural horror and the crushing depression of everyday life seamlessly. Taking place in the fictional village of Rawton in Lancashire, teenager Kieran Walker attempts to come to terms with his actions after he was reanimated along with thousands of other people in The Rising. From the beginning, we know he killed and fed upon a number of people. However, after months of rehab and medication for partially deceased syndrome, or PDS, he is given cosmetics to hide his status and sent home to his family in Rawton, a community where anti-rotter prejudice is rife. In the 3 episodes, the reactionary human volunteer force attempt to pin all of society's ills on the partially deceased, even those on medication, who they still see as inherently evil. Meanwhile, spineless government ministers attempt to appease those beliefs, asking the deceased to disguise themselves and to hide, rather than unconditionally endorsing their right to exist. Despite these alienating surroundings, Kieran learns through his relationships with other partially deceased individuals not to fear his identity, but rather to draw strength from it, in order to stand up against those who would seek to demonize and destroy him. At a time when the disabled face colossal welfare cuts and press demonization, when ethnic minorities are being scapegoated for high unemployment and crime figures, and when anyone different is being increasingly expected to integrate or be considered an enemy, the first series makes a subtle yet brilliant comment on the status of the other in modern British society, without giving a heavy-handed quick fix in its conclusion.
I don't feel ready. But that's why they say I am ready.
So, what have we learned? What have we learned? Well, apparently some scrawny pinko breather thinks that he's qualified to pontificate on the whole of zombiedom without actually talking to us. Okay, so how did you What, know what you were going to say? This is the fourth take, Jack. I've seen better presenting skills in corpses.
No, I mean, how did you talk? You were all...
I was concussed!
I feel like I should...
It's untie me, yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, what do you think of all this anyway?
Well, now that you actually ask. Frederick Jameson once said, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. And I think us rotters are traditionally used to embody that fear. Mass movements have spread across the globe, in Brazil, Turkey, Greece, Egypt. Even in the UK, things like the People's Assembly are springing up. It must feel to global capitalism's dominant class as if the world really is about to end. But let me ask you this. All over the world, the infamous 1% is beating, shooting, trying to silence ordinary people whose health and energy they sap to live in luxury. Who do you really need to worry about? The private cannibals cowering behind walls, or the ones out here helping you break them down? What, you think dead men can't be smart? Zombist?
So it's not just that zombies are like us. From the collective strength that strikes fear into governments' hearts the world over, to the battle for their soul between the forces of reaction and progress, they are us. So, in answer to that question of what would you do in a zombie apocalypse, probably join me.